The Buried Giant, Chapter 4. Never in his life had he seen his village from such a height and distance, and it amazed him. It was like an object he could pick up in his hand, and he flexed his fingers experimentally over the view in the afternoon haze. The old woman who had watched his ascent with anxiety was still at the foot of a tree, calling up to him to climb no further, but Edwin ignored her, for he knew trees better than anyone. When the warrior had ordered him to keep watch, he had selected the elm with care, knowing that for all its sickly appearance, it would possess its own subtle strength and welcome him. It commanded, moreover, the best view of the bridge and of the mountain road leading up to it, and he could see clearly the 3 soldiers talking to the rider. The latter had now dismounted, and holding his restless horse by the bridle, was arguing fiercely with the soldiers. He knew his trees, and this elm was just like Steffa. Let him be carried off and left to rot in the forest. That was what the older boys always said about Steffa. Isn't that what happens to old cripples unable to work? But Edwin had seen Steffa for what he was, an ancient warrior, still secretly strong, and with an understanding that went beyond even that of the elders. Steffa, alone in the village, had once known battlefields. It was the battlefields that had taken his legs, and that was why, in turn, Steffa had been able to recognize Edwin for what he was. There were other boys stronger who might amuse themselves pinning Edwin to the ground and beating him, but it was Edwin, not any of them, who possessed a warrior soul. "I've watched you, boy," old Steffa had once said to him. "Under a storm of fists, your eyes still calm, as if memorizing each blow. Eyes I've seen only on the finest warriors moving coldly through the rage of battle. Some day soon, you'll become one to fear." And now it was starting. It was coming true, just as Steffa had predicted. As a strong breeze swayed the tree, Edwin moved his grip to a different branch and tried again to recall the events of the morning. His aunt's face had become distorted out of all recognition. She had been shrieking a curse at him, but Elder Ivor had not let her finish, pushing her away from the doorway of the barn, blocking Edwin's view of her as he did so. His aunt had always been good to him, but if she now wanted to curse him, Edwin did not care. Not long ago she had tried to get Edwin to address her as mother, but he had never done so, for he knew his real mother was traveling. His real mother would not shriek at him like that, and would have to be dragged away by Elder Ivor. And this morning, in the barn, he had heard his real mother's voice. Elder Ivor had pushed him inside into the darkness, and the door had closed, taking away his aunt's twisted face, and all those other faces. At first the wagon had appeared only as a looming black shape in the middle of the barn. Then gradually he had distinguished its outline, and when he had reached towards it, the wood had felt moist and rotten. Outside the voices were shouting again, and then the cracking noises had come. They had started sporadically then, several had come at once, accompanied by a splintering sound, after which the barn had seemed slightly less dark. He knew the noises were stones striking the rickety walls, but he ignored them to concentrate on the wagon before him. How long ago had it last been used? Why did it stand so crookedly? If it was now of no use, why was it kept like this in the barn? It was then he had heard her voice, difficult to distinguish at first on account of the din outside and the sound of the stones, but it had grown steadily more clear. "It's nothing, Edwin," she was saying. "Nothing at all. You can bear it easily." "But the elders may not be able to hold them back forever," he said into the dark, though under his breath, even as his hand had stroked the side of the wagon. "It's nothing, Edwin. Nothing at all. The stones may break these thin walls. Don't worry, Edwin. Didn't you know those stones are under your control? Look, what's that before you? An old and broken wagon. Well, there you are. Go round and round the wagon, Edwin. Go round and round the wagon, because you're the mule tethered to the big wheel. Round and round, Edwin. The big wheel can only turn if you turn it, and only if you turn it can the stones be kept coming. Round and round the wagon, Edwin. Go round and round and round the wagon." "Why must I turn the wheel, Mother?" Even as he had spoken, his feet had started circling the wagon. "Because you're the mule, Edwin. Round and round. Those sharp cracking noises you hear, they can't continue unless you turn the wheel. Turn it, Edwin. Round and round the wagon." So he had followed her commands, keeping his hands on the upper edges of the wagon's boards, passing one hand over the other to maintain his momentum. How many times had he gone around it? 100? 200? He would keep seeing, in one corner, a mysterious mound of earth, in another corner, where a narrow line of sun fell across the floor of the barn, a dead crow on its side, feathers still intact. In the half-dark, these two sights, the mound of earth and the dead crow, had come round again and again. Once he had asked out loud, "Did my aunt really curse me?" But no reply had come, and he had wondered if his mother had gone away. But then her voice had returned, saying, "Do your duty, Edwin. You're the mule. Don't just stop just yet. You control everything. If you stop, so will those noises. So why fear them?" Sometimes he went 3 or even 4 times around the wagon without hearing a single sharp crack. But then, as though to compensate, several cracks would come at once, and the shouting outside would rise to a fever pitch. "Where are you, Mother?" he had asked once. "Are you still traveling?" No reply had come, but then several turns later she had said, "I'd have given you brothers and sisters, Edwin, many of them, but you're on your own, so find the strength for me. You're 12 years old, almost grown now. You must be by yourself 4, 5 strong sons. Find the strength and come rescue me." As another breeze rocked the elm, Edwin wondered if the barn he had been in was the same one in which the people had hidden the day the wolves had come to the village. Old Steffa had told him the story often enough. "You were very young then, boy, perhaps too young to remember. Wolves in broad daylight, 3 of them, walking calmly right into the village?" Then Steffa's voice would fill with contempt. The village hid in fear. Some men were away in the fields, it's true, but there were plenty still here. They hid themselves in the threshing barn. Not just the women and the children, but the men, too. The wolves had strange eyes, they said. Best not to challenge them, so the wolves took all they wished. They slaughtered the hens, feasted on the goats, and all the while the village hid, some in their houses, most in the threshing barn. Crippled that I am, they left me where I was, sitting in the barrow, these broken legs poking out beside the ditch outside Mrs. Mindred's. The wolves trotted towards me. "Come and eat me," I said. "I'll not hide in a barn for a wolf." But they cared not for me, and I watched them go right past, their fur as good as brushing these useless feet. They took all they wished, and only after they'd long departed did those brave men creep out of their hiding place. 3 wolves in daylight, and not a man here to stand up to them. He had thought about Steffa's story as he had circled the wagon. "Are you still traveling, Mother?" he had asked once more, and again had received no reply. His legs were growing weary, and he had grown heartily sick of seeing the mound of earth and the dead crow, when at last she had said, "Enough, Edwin. You've worked hard. Call your warrior now if you wish. Bring an end to it." Edwin had heard this with relief, but had carried on circling the wagon. To summon Wiston, he knew, would require immense effort. As he had the night before, he would have to will his coming from the very depths of his heart. But somehow he had found the strength, and once he was confident the warrior was on his way, Edwin had slowed his pace, for even mules were driven more slowly towards the end of a day, and noted with satisfaction the cracking noises were growing more sparse. But only when silence had continued for a long time did he finally stop, and leaning against the side of the wagon began to recover his breath. Then the barn door had opened, and the warrior had been standing there against the dazzling sunshine. Wiston had come in, leaving the door wide open behind him, as though to show his contempt for whatever hostile forces had lately been gathered outside. This had brought a large rectangle of sun into the barn, and when Edwin had glanced about himself, the wagon, so dominant in the dark, had looked pathetically dilapidated. Had Wiston called him young comrade straight away? Edwin was unsure, but he did remember the warrior leading him into that patch of light, lifting his shirt and scrutinizing the wound. Wiston had then straightened, glanced carefully over his shoulder, and said in a low voice, "So, my young friend, have you kept your promise of last night, about this wound of yours?" "Yes, sir. I've done just as you said." "You've told no one, not even your good aunt?" "I've told no one, sir, even though they believe it an ogre's bite and hate me for it." "Let them go on believing it, young comrade. 10 times worse if they learn the truth of how you received it." "But what of my 2 uncles who came with you, sir? Don't they know the truth?" "Your uncles, brave as they were, became too sick to enter the camp. so it's just the two of us who must keep the secret. And once the wound's healed, there's no need for anyone to wonder about it. Keep it as clean as you can and never scratch it by night or day. Do you understand?" "I understand, sir." Earlier, when they had been climbing the valley side and he had stopped to wait for the two elderly Britons, Edwin had tried to remember the circumstances around the wound. On that occasion, standing amidst the stubbled heather, tugging the reins of Wiston's mare, nothing had formed clearly in his mind. But now, in the branches of the elm, gazing at the tiny figures down on the bridge, Edwin found coming back to him the dank hair and blackness, the high smell of the bear skin covering the little wooden cage, the feel of the tiny beetles falling onto his head and shoulders when the cage was jolted. He recalled adjusting his posture and gripping the shaky grid before him to avoid being tossed about as the cage dragged along the ground. Then everything had become still again, and he had waited for the bearskin to be removed, for the cold air to rush in around him and to glimpse the night by the glow of the nearby fire. For this was what had happened twice already that night, and the repetition had removed the edge from his fear. He remembered more, the stink of the ogres, and the vicious little creature hurling itself at the rickety poles of the cage, obliging Edwin to push as far back as he could. The creature had moved so quickly it had been hard to get a clear view of it. He had the impression of something the size and shape of a cockerel, though with no beak or feathers. It attacked with teeth and claws, all the time letting out a shrill squawking. Edwin trusted the wooden poles against the teeth and claws, but now and then the little creature's tail would whip by accident against the cage, and then everything seemed much more vulnerable. Thankfully, the creature, still in its infancy, Edwin supposed, seemed oblivious to the power of its tail. Although at the time these attacks seemed to go on forever, Edwin now supposed that they had not lasted so long before the creature had been pulled back by its leash. Then the bearskin would thump over him, and all would be blackness again, and he would have to grip the poles as the cage was dragged to another spot. How often had he had to endure this sequence? Had it been just 2 or 3 times? Or as often as 10 or even 12? Perhaps after the first time he had fallen asleep, even in those conditions, and dreamt the rest of the attacks. Then, on that final occasion, the bearskin had not come off for a long time. He had waited, listening to the creature's squawks, sometimes far away, sometimes much closer, and the grumbling sounds the ogres made when talking to each other, and he had known that something different was about to happen. And it had been during those moments of dreadful anticipation that he had asked for a rescuer. He had made the request from the depths of his being, so it had been something almost like a prayer, and as soon as it had taken shape in his mind, he had felt certain that it would be granted. At that very moment, the cage had begun to tremble, and Edwin had realized the entire front section with its protective grid was being drawn aside. Even as this realization made him shrink back, the bearskin was pulled off and the ferocious creature flew at him. In his sitting position, his instinct was to raise his feet and kick out, but the creature was agile, and Edwin found himself beating it off with fists and arms. Once he thought the creature had gotten the better of him and had for an instant closed his eyes, but then opened them again to see his opponent clawing the air as the leash dragged it back. It was one of the few times that he had permitted a good glimpse of the creature, and he saw that his early impression had not been inaccurate. It looked like a plucked chicken, though with the head of a serpent. It came for him again, and Edwin was once more beating it off the best he could. Then, quite suddenly, the cage front was restored before him, and the bearskin plunged him back in blackness. And it had only been the moments afterwards, contorted inside the little cage, that he had felt the tingling on his left side, just beneath his ribs, and he had felt the wet stickiness there. Edwin adjusted again his foothold within the elm, and bringing down his right foot, touched gently his wound. There was no longer any depth to the pain. During the climb up the valley side, the coarseness of his shirt had at times made him grimace, but when he was still, as he was now, he could hardly feel a thing. Even that morning in the barn, when the warrior had examined it in the doorway, it had seemed little more than a cluster of tiny punctures. The wound was superficial, not as bad as any he had had before, and yet because people believed it to be an ogre's bite, it had caused all this trouble. Had he faced the creature with even more determination, perhaps he could have avoided receiving any wound at all, but he knew there was no shame in how he had faced his ordeal. He had never cried out in terror, or pleaded to the ogres for mercy. After the little creature's first lunges, which had taken him by surprise, Edwin had met it with his head held high. In fact, he had had the presence of mind to realize the creature was an infant, and that one could, in all probability, create fear in it, just as one might in an unruly dog. And so he had kept his eyes open and tried to stare it down. His real mother, he knew, would be particularly proud of him for this. Indeed, now that he thought about it, the venom had gone out of the creature's attacks soon after its opening forays, and it had been Edwin who had gained more and more control of the combat. He recalled again the creature clawing the air, and it seemed to him now likely it had not been displaying an eagerness to continue the fight, but simply panic at the choking leash. It was quite possible, in fact, the ogres had judged Edwin the victor of the encounter, and that was why proceedings had been brought to an end. "I've watched you, boy," old Steffa had said. "You have something rare. One day you'll find someone to teach you the skills to match your warrior soul. Then you'll be the one to fear indeed. You'll not be the one to hide in a barn while mere wolves still unhindered about the village." And it was all coming to pass. The warrior had chosen him, and they were to go together to fulfill an errand. But what was their task? Wiston had not made it clear, saying only that it was his king, far away in the Finland, who was even now waiting to hear of its conclusion. And why travel with these two elderly Britons who required rest at each turn of the road? Edwin gazed down at them. They were now discussing something earnestly with the warrior. The old woman had given up trying to talk him down, and all three were now watching the soldiers on the bridge from behind the cover of two giant pines. From his own vantage point, Edwin could see the rider had remounted and was gesticulating into the air. Then the three soldiers appeared to move away from him, and the rider turned his horse, set off at a gallop away from the bridge, back down the mountain. Edwin had wondered earlier why the warrior had been so reluctant to stay on the main mountain road, insisting on the steep cut up the valley side. Now it was obvious that he had wished to avoid riders such as the one that they had just seen. But there now seemed no way to proceed with their journey without going down onto the road, crossing the bridge past the waterfall, and the soldiers were still there. Had Wiston been able to see from down where he was that the rider had departed? Edwin wanted to alert him to this development, but felt he should not shout from the tree in case the soldiers somehow caught the sound. He would have to climb down and tell Wiston. Perhaps while there would have been 4 potential opponents, the warrior would have been hesitant about a confrontation. But now, with only 3 at the bridge, he would consider the odds in his favor. Had it just been Edwin and the warrior, they would surely have gone down to face the soldiers long ago. But the presence of the elderly couple must have made Wiston cautious. No doubt Wiston had brought them along for a good reason, and they had so far been kind to Edwin, but they were frustrating companions all the same. He remembered again his aunt's contorted features. She had started to shriek a curse at him, but none of that mattered any more. For he was with the warrior now, and he was traveling just like his real mother. Who was to say they might not come across her? She would be so proud to see him standing there, side by side with the warrior, and the men with her would tremble.